Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Transforming Assessment session. Today's session is on assessment decision making and how technology can influence assessment or e-assessment design. The presenters today are Phillip Dawson from Monash University and Sue Bennett from the University of Wollongong. So please, Phil, you're welcome to go.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, and thanks a lot to everyone for coming along. So I'm Phillip Dawson from Monash. Just in case you thought this was Sue's voice, could you say something, Sue, so people know your voice?
So this is me, Sue, obviously different to Phil.
Awesome, thanks. We were thinking that today we would have me do a lot of the talking with the slides, and Sue might sort of corral the text chat. So if you've got some questions along the way, we'd really love to have those as we go. Sue will sort of do a bit of judgment about chucking them in as we go, or at some of our particular spots to talk. And yeah, as Matthew says, comments are very welcome too. I've done one of these before and I really loved the back channel that was going along there. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to have sort of a few big blocks here, and by big, hopefully 10 minutes-ish, with some talking. Going to have an introduction to our project and the concept that we want to talk about, as well as what is hopefully a really interesting case, and then a bit of a break to discuss. Then we're going to talk about the broader results and implications beyond just that one case, and then we're going to go on to talk about some resources that we've produced out of this project that we hope will help you. Okay, so this presentation is around a project called the Assessment Decisions Project. Thank you very much, Matthew, for putting up the web link there. You can get a bit more information about the project there and also the full team details. We have Sue and I here today, and I think we might have Gordon Joggin in the chat somewhere as well, maybe. He was going to be somewhere else in the world, so he may not. Okay, but yeah, we got funding from the Federal Government Office for Learning and Teaching for this project. The project came from this sort of idea of how do university teachers make decisions about assessment? How do we end up with the assessment designs in practice that we have? So from that sort of concern, we went out and talked with university teachers who have recently made assessment changes or taught new subjects. And we then went and built some tools out of what they've told us, out of the literature, and out of some of the expertise in the group. There are some real assessment luminaries in the group that we've been able to lean on, people like Gordon Joggin and David Bowd. So when we say assessment decisions, we're particularly meaning decisions in the design and implementation of assessment. That's where we tended to focus. But you could also use, I guess, assessment decisions to describe judgments and marking about individual student work. That wasn't really where we focused. And you could also think about the formulation of assessment policy. And certainly those two other levels influence this design stage, but we saw this as really critical. So this was what we went and talked to people about. We thought we'd get a whole bunch of things like this, you know, the blank canvas, a new unit, what assessment do I choose? We thought people would tell us stuff like that. We thought, you know, we get this unit's been assessed the same way for years, but it's not working. What can we do differently? Or, you know, will I put the paperwork in to replace that exam with a project, even though it won't come into effect until next year? These are the sort of pragmatics that we wanted to go and talk with people about. And there's a little bit of research in this space. We've got sort of three grabs here. You know, achieving a balance between summative and formative assessment requires complex contextual thinking. But even beyond that, changing assessment thinking in academics doesn't necessarily lead to changes in practice. And then we've got some really interesting research, and I really love this paper by, I think it's David Carless, that trust might play a part in our choice of some assessment types over others, and you know, students trust us, and the institution trusts or distrusts us. And I guess this research, to me, presented that it might actually be more complex than I'd thought to improve assessment. And we do know quite a lot about ideal assessment practice. This slide hopefully will load soon for you. I've got it here, but I've got a sort of the classic Hattie effect size table of, that's from one of his papers about assessment. We've got all these effect sizes on these practices that we could do, and we've got actual practice as it exists, and there's something mediating that, and we thought assessment decision making might be a part of that. So we went out with this core question of how do university teachers make decisions about assessment, and along the way we've also sort of wondered, what influence does technology have? So we talked to 30 academics. We tried to get a balance of some of the arts sort of disciplines and some of the sciences, some professional disciplines, some non-professions. We tried to get at the gritty actual stuff, not the ideal stuff. So we tried to get people to tell us what they actually do, not what they think they should do. And we've conducted some thematic analysis, developed a bit of a framework, done some attempts to make some sense of it. We tried to look at how do these decisions actually work. One approach we've had to looking at it has been looking at what are the impetuses for assessment change, and then, when I know that I've got to do something differently, what influences that, and then what are the actual on-the-ground activities to make it happen. So now I'll jump over to a particular case that we have here. So this is John, the health professions educator. I've tried to anonymise it, so this isn't actually a picture of John, and John's not his real name. So John teaches a third-year unit. It's a health professions unit. It's got a practical skills focus. When we talked with John about what he does in his assessment, John sort of sees himself more the innovator and the strategist than the technologist. And I think this is particularly helpful here because John's not a technology guy. John went and introduced some video-based assessment work. So John found that, well, students have got a lot of these cameras. We could be doing something with video, but that wasn't actually the impetus for John's decision. The impetus for John's decision sort of came out of this particular sort of assessment that he was doing that wasn't working. John was doing some objective structured clinical examinations, or OSCEs, and these OSCEs were way too resource intensive. John noticed students have got these devices, maybe we could film them doing stuff, or even better, get them to film themselves doing stuff, and then we could come up with less resource intensive ways to assess them. So students demonstrate these skills, they undertake some sort of structured reflection and feedback, and then John found this actually builds a resource bank for the future. So we talked with John and tried to find out, what does the decision making that leads up to that sort of a design look like? Now, here we have, and if this is a picture, this isn't text. This is a, wow, this is complex sort of moment rather than trying to understand all the boxes on there. I put this up there to show that things were actually a bit more complex than we thought they'd be. There was a lot that went into John's decision to do just this one different assessment task differently. What we'll do is we'll focus a bit on a few of the parts of John's decision, or I guess the bones of the skeleton. I hope you don't mind the skeletal metaphors through this because they're all through the presentation. So if you don't like them, you'd better go. Okay. So we tried to nail down, oh gosh, a bone to pick with this, ouch. We tried to nail down, well, what actually caused you to make this change? And so John was talking about the previous practices were ridiculously time consuming and resource consuming. They could get a sessional tutor at $100 and something an hour. Must be health professions land. And our budget doesn't cover that sort of session or staff time. So there was a difference between sort of continuing on with this practice that wasn't sustainable, that might be ideal, with actually doing what's going to work. So we found that for John, the key impetus was efficiency. So it's worth noting here that John didn't choose to use technology because he wanted to use technology. John chose to use technology because current practices were not sustainable. So we then went and had a chat about, well, what were the influences around this? So John had some influences that came from him, John the educator. I love this thing. He says, sometimes I wonder why I didn't leave things exactly as they were. But I also really enjoy taking on something that's challenging and changing it. So John's sort of got this identity. John talks about himself as this innovator. John's got strong beliefs about assessment. In another bit of the discussion, John talks about how assessment workload needs to be manageable. It's got to be manageable for him, for his tutors, for the students. John's got a desire for assessment to be authentic. John's got a desire for assessment to be a producer of resources, not just a consumer. So all of this going into why John uses technology. So it was actually a bit more complex than, this caricature we sometimes have of academics that, want to play with new tech. This wasn't John at all. So there were also some influences over John that came from this environment that he was in, and also the environment that students end up in. So in the clinic, students are watched all the time. It raises their heart rate, it makes them sweat a little. So John thought, well, video will get students used to performing. Surviving in the clinical setting is being good at performing. It's a feedback mechanism. It's a way to get them used to being watched. So John had these ideas about where students end up in, and he wanted to put them through it. I don't think John's particularly perverse here, although it did feel a little bit like John wants to test them a little bit, get them to experience that. And John also had to make it happen. So he sort of said, well, if one of the 60 student videos didn't work, if they stuffed up, didn't upload the right file or something, he had to do a lot of chasing up. So then he thought, well, let's just review 15 of them from the cohort. We'll review their work, and then we'll feed back to some of them. So John went through sort of this iterative process of improving the task. He figured out that he needed certain sorts of evidence to convince certain sorts of people. We've got in our data John going through with his bosses to try to convince them this is the sort of task he needs to do. John even goes to the extent of getting quite scholarly about it and trying to do some research on it. So I'll break here for a bit. Sue, would you be able to jump in on some of these questions?
Sure. I guess it's a good point to just stop and ask anybody if they want to type a question into the chat box about it. What I think is interesting about John and about some of the other cases that of people we spoke to is that technology wasn't the driver, it wasn't the impetus, and that mostly academics became interested in technology and e-assessment where it spoke to their other practical concerns. So it might have been efficiency, it might have been wanting to address cheating, might have been more positive, might have been wanting to increase flexibility or change the way students engaged in a subject. So very much strongly driven by the pedagogy first. And you might also say, well, this is possibly a function of the kind of people we spoke to, because obviously these people were volunteers. So that's important to bear in mind as well. So they're a particular set of people who are engaged in assessment design. And not, as Phil says, then we didn't seek out technology innovators So one of the things I find interesting about this group is that it's sort of looking at a different group of people really willing to pick up technology and innovate, but not necessarily seeing themselves as techie people. So thanks, Glenn, for your comment about, you know, it was interesting, this kind of way of increasing efficiency, and, you know, we might kind of critique perhaps that individual feedback, and we did ask him about that, and John came back and said actually he'd had only good feedback from students about not getting individualised feedback, which was pretty interesting. And so, yes, John was reflective, and that was one of the things that came through particularly, and we wanted to show his case because he did speak about it in a very reflective way, but also that strategic element I think was really interesting. So Joe's got an interesting question there about, did John encourage his fellow academics? John actually made a really good point about how he did share this with his fellow academics, but I also I like the way he commented on how difficult sometimes it is to transfer one idea to another context, because what he found was that some of his colleagues then tried to take that on and make it more complex, or he said more controlling, and he found that sometimes that really increased the workload, and it wasn't as successful for them, so then they dropped it. Phil, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I got a real sense that John felt they were stuffing up this beautiful thing that he'd done, and almost that perhaps some of the shine might come off his great practice that other people were trying to replicate. Yeah, I guess there was a little bit of a thing about workload or whatever, and yeah, I think, you know, numbers sort of do increase, and John just sort of had to deal with it. In other bits of our data set, that is a real present thing, that student numbers increase, and at one stage certain practices are okay, but they just aren't scalable. And I think for John, this was a really scalable practice, particularly only giving feedback to some of them.
And George, you've got a good question there about what other people did. There were people who were just perhaps also felt like their assessment was inefficient, but also some people just felt their assessment was inaccurate. It wasn't actually, it either wasn't discriminating really sufficiently between students, or it just wasn't really the kind of assessment that was the best kind of assessment for that particular subject area. And I think that was most noticeable in the professions, where, as you'd expect, there was more of an interest in making sure assessment aligned with sort of real-world practice as well, making that really relevant. Phil, should we keep going on, do you think, given the time?
Yeah, okay. I'm just looking at those last couple of questions there. This was one piece of assessment in one course or subject or unit. This wasn't the whole assessment for it. And I think as well, this was potentially quite a formative task in there, that there were other sort of assessments of it as well.
Yeah, actually there's a good point to add about this assessment, which is, so it had students filming themselves while they were doing a particular clinical skill. They were then had to look at the feedback provided on the clip of the week, they called them, like a series of clips with more detailed feedback that represented the kind of strengths and weaknesses. They then had to do a self-critique of their own piece, and that was a different assessment task. And then beyond that, just to give you a sense of how this task evolved over multiple years, the year later, John, I almost forgot his name, John then introduced the ability for students to choose their own clinical skill that they wanted to demonstrate and then do the same process but have a sort of, I think he had a sort of peer assessment going there. So that's the idea of that those videos became a resource. So if you think kind of conceptually what he was trying to achieve, that's how he achieved the video as the basis for kind of living on a living resource for the subject.
Yeah, and I think it's great when he says that these demonstrations, the really, really good ones, are as good as him as a very experienced practitioner. Yeah, that's quite amazing. He's got this resource bank.
Yeah, and they become part of the case set, the cases that are available to the students.
Okay, look, I might crack on, trying not to do too many bone-breaking sort of jumps. Okay, so onto some broader results and implications. So here, leaving just John behind and thinking about the set as a whole. I guess, thanks for the recognition of the puns. So where technology was a driver, efficiency was really the main reason. So where someone made the decision to use technology, sorry, I've stuffed up. Let me try that again. Where I've got to make a change and technology is the answer, it was usually because I need efficiency. I've got the dumb terminal in there because in some cases there was really a push towards some actually quite old low-tech methods, things like multiple choice questions for efficiency. John's a bit of an exception to that. John's is a bit more high-tech. Efficiency wasn't always bad though, because we've got cases in there of publisher-provided online resources that made it more efficient to do good practice, like supporting certain cohorts of students better. So if you've got a set of physics students who have low math skills, we've got examples in there of some really good, efficient remedial work that's possible because of publisher-provided resources. Similarly, we've got some examples in our data set of people who are great at physics and not that great at writing essays, doing essay writing units and needing some help there. So technology was great for efficiency for some, sort of summative MCQ style things, but also for some really good formative feedback. So that in there is a Trojan mouse. I hope you really like it. I didn't draw it. But when we were talking with people about how they sort of saw technology, or when they were just telling us, they saw it as kind of an enabler, an encourager of good practice, or even a catalyst for change. So sometimes various technological rollouts, new learning management systems or whatever, may have been that bit of a catalyst to change assessment. And this is really nice for the whole Trojan mouse crowd, the universities that change the learning management system and hope that that leads to pedagogical improvements. I'm not sure how strong that was in our data set, but it was there to a small extent. Technology was also seen as kind of good for learning by some people, good for assessment, the modern way, the way we should be doing things. So that was sort of another overarching influence that it had. So if I up the technology, it will be good because that's the way we should be doing things. That's the way things are moving. But technology also came with risk. There was this sense that if you set something up and it doesn't work, students don't trust you, and getting them back on board again is a killer. Students can be very hostile to you making mistakes. So there's a little bit of sort of tentative attitudes towards using technology because I might break it. I guess there were other risks as well that people talked about. Back with the publisher-provided resources, people also talked about sort of vendor lock-in concerns. If I go out and try to use this publisher-provided resource, then I'm worried that they might up the price, the university might no longer support it. So there were those sorts of risks there, those worries. It's sort of not just the tool is owned by an external vendor, but kind of the task is owned by an external vendor, and that was a little bit scary. And I say this as someone who built units assessment around Google Wave once, right in the semester that they pulled that, so I have some empathy for them. There were also cases where specific technological affordances influenced assessment. We're able to do a task in this way or assess this thing because the tool allows us. And we've got a case in our data set of, I can track individual student contributions because a wiki lets me do that. We've got other examples in there because, say, if a university's unit outline generating tool has a drop-down box of assessment types I can choose from, then I might choose from things that are on the drop-down box. I might think of the assessment task ahead of time, I might pick from the list. Or alternatively, I might try and make what I want to do fit in the list. We've even got a case in the data set where someone says, well, the new learning management system has a box for bonus marks. I didn't know we could give bonus marks. I'm going to give bonus marks now. So the way that the technology was set up allows me to assess in kind of different ways, or suggests task types, maybe even allows me to break the rules. So a nice heartening thing for EdTech people, and I guess for you there, Sue, was one of the editors of AGET, I guess we did see some examples in our data set of people saying, well, I looked at the educational technology research literature and people were doing this, so I went and tried it out in my own practice. So we've got some really nice cases in our data of, there was a special issue of some journal about e-assessment, so I went and gave it a go. That's actually really nice. There's possibly even as much of this sort of EdTech research literature use as there is of the assessment research literature use. So that's nice, that's heartening. EdTech research that you guys all do makes a difference, perhaps. So what's absent? Well, one thing that was kind of absent was any sort of real consideration or use of educational technology policy. So people demonstrate some sort of awareness of assessment policy at their universities in our data. And, admittedly, sometimes when we challenged people about that, their understanding of what the policy was and what the policy actually was not accurate. But they didn't even really mention EdTech policy. So some things that might be an issue here are things like using outside tools. Does the university allow that? Does the university support it? Issues around privacy, issues around what happens if something goes wrong and they pull the tool, like my Google Wave experience. So we didn't really see any consideration of that in our data. So perhaps that's something for those of you with an influence there to have a go at. So I'll just jump over to some more discussion now. Sue, I've noticed you've been back-channeling a little bit. Do you want to jump in?
Well, I'll just actually jump in and just mention something on that last point. There was such an interesting mix of people who either were really unaware of the policy in their local context, or they knew that there was kind of something that they figured it was too hard to deal with, so they worked around it. And they had some pretty ingenious ways of working around it as well. So there's clearly something there about a disjuncture between what it is people are actually doing in terms of assessment design and also introducing technology into assessment design, and what universities think they're doing when think is happening with policy. So, Matthew, your question about EdTech policy, and it probably doesn't, it's certainly at Wollongong there's policies around using technology for teaching, and there's set policy for assessment. Those aren't necessarily well joined together, but it's not necessarily kind of joined to academics practice either. Yeah, so I agree, Matthew, that point at the juncture with assessment. There's not much there to help people out. Sometimes it does have trouble keeping pace with technology, so sometimes new tools enter the university officially and policy hasn't kept pace. We've got that situation at the moment a little bit with some of the new tools we've recently introduced. But also, as Phil mentioned, there's people who kind of go off reservation and use external tools, and they're not necessarily keeping up with the kind of policy or practice policy, but policy isn't keeping up with what they're doing either. And the point about policy and theory and actual practices, well, that's some of the differences we explored. So I'll give you an example, is that at one place there was a particular technology designed to help academics construct their course outline or subject outline, unit outline, and it didn't make any sense to people, so they just found ways around making it work to what they wanted. So they couldn't find the right terminology in the drop-down list, so they just chose something and then tried to explain it in the text. So yeah, so some of the tools put in place to help actually hindered as well.
Yeah, and that issue of sort of assessment decision models and clinical decision making, that sort of thing, I guess we came into this project with decision making at the front of our minds and then have looked for it, and I guess there's been a lot of really interesting debate amongst the team about, is what we're looking at decision making, or is it design, or is it something else? Sue, would you like to talk about that a bit?
Well, it's good that Gordon's here and he might be able to pop in and talk about decision making, but it's one of those examples where you use a term fairly lightly, decision, and it seems like it's something that's got a fairly straightforward meaning, and then you start to explore it and you realize that it doesn't. In terms of a lot of the things that people talked about, though, it did sit very well with some of the ideas around design. So some of those, certainly the iterative practices, the anticipating in the future. And Glenn has got a comment there about, do practitioners formally evaluate their practices? And probably then they're not doing that really overtly, but they're taking cues from a whole range of things in their environment. So particularly they're looking for evidence from evaluations, Joe, so evaluations that might be done of the subject or the teaching, but also they're really using performance on the assessment task as a cue. So really obvious things that we're always looking for. Is this giving me the kind, or encouraging the students to produce the kind of work I want them to? Or are they misunderstanding the task? Or alternatively, where they can test against competency, which in John's case was kind of easier to measure because the competencies were more strict, then they're looking at those kinds of things. And so they're in that big complex diagram that Phil had before. We actually came up with this term that was not very helpful, but we called it backwash, because we were trying to capture the idea that there's all this information that comes back to the person making the assessment design from the environment, and it comes from students, it comes from student performance, but it also comes from tutors or other demonstrators who are working in that unit. And all of that is taken into account for the next iteration. So that's what fits quite well with the design kind of model idea.
Yeah, I have to say I found the backwash stuff to be really interesting. There was just a lot of it in there. I hate the term backwash, but we went with that. But yeah,
we're still working on something better.
Yeah, we are. If anyone's got any ideas for backwash, better terms, then please suggest. The elaboration, yeah, it is. So I guess it
thanks,
was
Joe.
just...
Sorry, Phil, I'm getting carried away.
That's terrible, Joe. But yeah, backwash was such a strong presence in there, and it's from so many different people. There was a little bit to Glenn's question of, do practitioners formally evaluate their practices to decide whether what they are doing is an improvement? Oh, bother, I'd read that, decide what they're doing is an assessment. And to answer the question that I thought I'd read, I guess we had a lot of people in there doing a variety of things that they thought were assessment or not. Are only the graded things assessment? Some of the formative only tasks assessment. We've even had someone in the data set who really took issue with the whole idea of assessment. I only assess because the university makes me. So I guess people's conceptions of assessment are incredibly broad in our data. Okay, so I might move on from here. We've got another pause for discussion after this next set. So this is the touting of our wares part of the presentation, and hopefully you'll be interested in our framework to support assessment decisions and our insights for university learning and teaching leaders. These are coming soon attached to these. We're having a meeting with our reference group for the project tomorrow to go through some of the content, hopefully one last time, before we then go out and try and work with some actual assessment practitioners, people at the coalface, on improving assessment with some of these tools. So our big deliverable is a framework to support assessment decisions. So here we're looking at questions, prompts, guidance to inform assessment decisions, and there's a focus on the real, not the ideal, on practical, pragmatic stuff. It's based on substantial evidence from the project, but also scholarship and expertise from within the project team. So at the moment, that looks like a one-page document there on the middle bottom of the page, and kind of a 50-page document on the middle right of the page. That stuff is being developed into a web resource. The tool itself really focuses on expanding out that decision around assessment into a whole bunch of kind of sub-decisions. So, how does this deal with these different purposes of assessment? How does the assessment deal with the unit learning outcomes or the needs of the profession? How are you going to sell this to students? How are you going to sell it to colleagues? How are you going to make this work? So really looking at how people worked in practice in getting assessment going, and then trying to support that. So rather than being prescriptive with how you should do assessment, we're trying to question you and lead you through some inquiry to make it happen. Now, I've ripped off the core education's 10 trends thing there on the bottom right. That's the sort of design we're going with. So kind of pulling out into some of the themes and then linking off to further resources. So we've got a fair bit of content there to support. Hopefully that's over the next month or two, that'll be online. And I've got a website, our project website you can go to if you want to join a mailing list and get notified when that's available. So another resource is insights for university learning and teaching leaders. One of the things we found, and this may come as no surprise to you, but learning and teaching leaders really do influence assessment and culture. So there we're looking at associate heads of school, course leaders, all the way up to deputy vice-chancellors, pro-vice-chancellors, those sorts of people. They can have a real influence. So here we've taken insights from the same set of data and expertise to help them help people who work, for them. So our hope is with this document to kind of remove some of those barriers that exist for people doing great assessment practices, but also to show some of the great stuff that really does work well. So that's just a two-pager. Hopefully, if you like it, you'll be able to give it to your deputy vice-chancellor, head of school, etc., to say this is what a big project has found might help improve university assessment. So those are our two really big resources. you can get more information about the project on our project website. We've got a mailing list there you can join to learn more about it. There should be a link on there to a preliminary research paper we've published about the project. You can get in touch with any of the project team directly to learn more about the project as well, or if you're interested in some sort of a presentation around any of our resources or around the project, feel free to get in touch. So I'll break for some more bony discussion here.
Nice pun again, Phil. Just while people are thinking of their questions, I just wanted to add that those 5 points that we developed for sort of, university decision makers, they're written in a very positive way. You can probably imagine that a lot of the data we got, a lot of people did talk about the challenges and some of the barriers, but there were a lot of people talking about enablers. So in both cases, we tried to reframe it into the positive because, we're really aware that it's you don't want to just bring up problems. You want to point to some kind of positive action or some kind of enablers that could be could play a part in a university environment or some policy thinking.
Yeah, it's a positively framed document. It's not a complainy one. So, for example, there's a discussion about peer review improving assessment. Within our data set, we had some really lovely informal peer review practices that certain course teams have just taken up. So when someone in the course wants to improve their assessment, they actually go through some sort of a process of showing each other, giving feedback, that sort of thing. We found that those were really positive, and where they were meaningful, they were well loved by people.
Yeah, and I noticed that Gordon has ducked off, obviously, so he doesn't need to say anything about decision making, which is a bit of a shame because it's Gordon's got into some great literature there, so let's hope he can reconnect. Oh, technical issues. Yes, that's the challenge, not being at a visual location.
Wow, so it's a kaleidoscope now, is it? The backwash. That would be interesting.
Well, we can certainly take that back to the team. We have had a lot of discussion about whether that was really appropriate.
So is John a shiny example of success in the field? That's really interesting. I guess to give you my gut feeling, yeah, John's doing some good work. John put in a lot of work to make it happen, but it's also something that's paid off in the end. Yeah, I'd say John is probably a great sort of positive success case, but he's also not someone who was operating in special circumstances. John's a coalface educator. He's, large classes, the challenges of teaching and research, that sort of stuff. He's not someone who's come from a strong technology background. So yeah, I think John is the shiny example, tassel of the skeleton. Okay.
I think the other thing to say about John too, I think we chose him because he was such a good example of somebody who'd been really strategic in getting and thinking in the long term about getting the things that he wanted done. So he was a particular kind of example. Yeah, and Kat's got a good point. And so it may be a really good way to get people motivated about something if they can see a colleague who they think is a non-techie person adopting something, or that colleague can explain it in a particular way so that other people feel confident about taking that up. And, that's another strategy to think about because, again, the people we spoke to, none of them regarded themselves as techie people, but they were looking for ways that they could integrate the technology that they had available to help them solve some of those existing problems that they'd identified. Phil, what did you do with this skeleton metaphor?
Yeah, I think it was a bad choice. I'll have to find a new metaphor for the future. But yeah, local champions, yeah, I really agree with you. And that thing about near neighbours in the corridor, so much of our data involves people who, I talk to the guy in the office next door to me, or we chat in the tea room or in the hallway. I'd say a lot of that seems to be the site of learning about good assessment practice. I mean, we've also got some great examples of, I went to this workshop or I did this graduate certificate or whatever, and as someone who's given a workshop and teaches in a graduate certificate, that's nice. But, the people, the real people out there at the coalface seem to be the strong influence.
So in answer to Glenn's question, certainly in terms of John's case, he had a number of tech failures. That quote that he had about the number of students' videos failing, and it took him a long time to chase it down. That was the first year that he implemented it, and he learned a lot from that, and he implemented some different supports the next year. So he used that to evolve his design. There were other people though who had tech failures in a particular subject, and then had realised that they needed to think a little bit more about the implications of their choice of technology. And it didn't mean, certainly in this case, it didn't mean that they didn't go back to using technology, but I think one of the perhaps positive outcomes was greater reflection, so not just leaping to use something in an unthinking way. Phil, can you remember anything? I can remember people wanting to do more efficient marking, and John's an example of that.
Yeah, I mean, John, to be cynical, part of John's approach of doing efficient marking is doing less marking. But I mean, for John, I guess John had quite an enlightened view of feedback, around sort of understanding of performance and seeing an expert performance and taking feedback on that on board, and it was quite sophisticated rather than just the student wanting comments directly on their work. I guess the efficient marking and feedback, multiple choice questions were a part of this. There was even feedback or feed forward. I'm trying to think. I mean, we did talk to people about sort of task design at that unit level, and there were definitely people who had planned tasks that flow onto each other, although I'm not sure how many of those were technology mediated.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. So I was thinking about the fact that for a lot of people, efficiency came from things like multiple choice, things that could be automated. And we didn't really see too many examples of feedback for that higher order and creative thinking. So I'm wondering whether that's the people who we spoke to, or it might be it might genuinely be a reflection of what people immediately think technology is going to be useful for. So perhaps there's sort of an assumption there that that's where it's going to be most relevant, and people haven't accessed those alternative technology supportive ways of giving good feedback on those other kinds of tasks.
Yeah, I mean, some of the publisher-provided resources had built-in feedback. You do some question on physics and it gives you feedback on that, and you learn and you can keep at it until you get it right. I think there was some sort of efficiency desires out of that. But yeah, I'd say feedback wasn't often a driver for the use of technology in there.
It was more those other things. And there was a big discussion, we didn't see it in John's case, but there was a big discussion around using technology to deter plagiarism and cheating, and just to make sure that cheating couldn't happen in various types of assessment designs. And then the flip side of that, not wanting to use particular types of technology-based assessment because they might enable cheating. So if you think about something like an online quiz, with more than one person said, well, I don't want to do a quiz, or if I include a quiz, I'm going to make it very low marks because I'm concerned that there's not going to be integrity in that task.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've got some data in there of someone saying that they're actually okay about the students colluding with each other around this because it's a bit of a learning activity.
That was a language teacher who was quite happy for her students to be looking things up or discussing, I should say, with each other. So because that would be engaging them with the quiz material. But not everyone had that particular view. Yes, and Joe's got a good point. Should be testing their application rather than memorization. We didn't really kind of get into that detail, but that would fall under better practice.
With that issue of creativity, are you meaning creativity in terms of the decision or creativity in terms of wanting more creativity in the tasks? Okay, so I guess, that decision making, part of why we like design, I guess, is having that creativity in there versus decision making. We have had some sort of debate about that. I mean, when we talked to John about, why do you use video? And I think the question is asked sort of, well, why do you use video? So what made you use video? That sort of thing over and over. John actually couldn't get at exactly what it was. And it does feel a bit like this is John's creative outlet. We do have some examples of people wanting more creativity for the students as well. What do you think, Sue?
Yeah, I think there were both of those things. I'm just thinking about, we had a big discussion around what were some of the ways that people described themselves. Now, John's an example of somebody who talked about himself as an innovator, but he wasn't the only one. So there was an element of people identifying themselves as being creative through their assessment design, and that's why that kind of all fitted conceptually for us. But there were other people who wanted to enable students to be more creative through the use of technology. They saw it as a means of enabling students to both make choices but also be creative by producing kind of different products to the usual kind of very text-based or perhaps, just the standard kind of quiz option.
Yeah, and that issue of having too many tasks of the same type was definitely a part of people's decisions. There was a lot of discussion about, some great practice where people meet up and, the whole course team figures out what sort of assessments have they got this semester and they plan them out so there's not too much of any particular thing. But yeah, I'm guessing that overloading with video didn't happen yet, but it may in the future.
Yeah, Andrew, that's a good point about sort of trying to sometimes shift the way students perceive assessment as well. And that was discussed by some people, and it kind of comes into that idea we had of backwash, now kaleidoscope, is the need to take students with you. And a lot of people talked about the need to really, when they were doing something different, to really explain the task and really make sure that students had bought into it as well. And some of those quotes that are about, making the mistakes or avoiding the mistakes is when you've started to do something innovative but not really thought about how it's going to be perceived by the students.
Yeah,
can I just butt in here for a sec? Sorry. I want to move the slides forward, and so, okay, here's the references for people. Others, please keep typing your questions into the chat because we'll keep going. But I just wanted to display the references here as a, I suppose, a formality, and then is the real slide I want people to click on to do the feedback survey. Now, the feedback survey is a little bit odd this time in that we didn't really have a thing that Phil and Sue showed. We just had a wonderful discussion, so fill it in as best as you can. But please keep asking your questions.
So I'm not sure. Oh, sorry, you go, Sue.
No, I was just going to say, and probably comment on the quality of the jokes that were made.
Oh yes, of course, must quality on the bones of the matter.
Oh, ouch. So I mean that issue of were they given any video production guidance? I don't think John actually talked about that, and he did talk about the issue of access to devices and said that all but one of the students had access to a great device, but no, there wasn't really much discussion of that.
He did actually say, I can recall this because I was just studying it before our seminar today. He talked about how they tried to set up a room for the students to do their videos in, but it wasn't very convenient and they needed more flexibility. So they just got students, they did a little survey and they were asking students whether they had a device, and that's all they were really worried about, and they didn't really worry about video design as such. They just were concerned that students could take a video of themselves demonstrating that clinical skill. So, and I suppose if you wanted something more than that, then that is something that you'd have to think about, is what kind of support you need to give students to do well in that kind of task. And I want to go back to Glenn's question about authentic approaches that were also efficient. It was interesting to me that there were a number of people who were making their assessment more authentic, and as I said before, those tended to be people who were engaged in the professions, but not exclusively. And they were driven more by that, and then they had to think about the logistics of doing it. So sometimes what happened is that they would have a great idea for a task that would make it more authentic, and then they would have to scale it back because they'd need to think of the logistics. And that's not necessarily just in terms of technology, but it was sometimes just in terms of practicality, like, are there enough sites for our students to get to do this particular thing? So there's that complexity between, you might have something that's a driver, but you've still got to think about all of those other things, resourcing, supporting the students, bringing them with you, workload for everybody. So there were certainly some examples in the data set that would speak to that as well. So has anybody got any sort of burning question that we've missed while trying to, it's actually really challenging trying to read the chat. I'm glad I wasn't doing this on my own, Phil.
Yeah, I'm glad I wasn't either. I've been trying to madly read back through. I hope we haven't missed anything.
And if we have, of course, you've got our emails and you can get in touch with us at any time. John didn't comment on about whether they put it in their resumes. We didn't get to that detail. And Glenn, the commentary was that self-critique I mentioned, so they would, that's what I recall it being. So they had to produce the video and then they did a self-critique of the video afterwards. Joe, thank you for your participation. The puns have been incredible. They've just not stopped.
Well, yeah, I think think that could be that. But please, as Sue said, do get in touch with either Sue or I or anyone else on the project team. Matthew shared the project website with you, so our contact details should be up on there. We'd love to hear from you.
And if you do want to hear anything about the decision-making stuff, I'm sure Gordon would be happy to reply to an email since he hasn't been able to join us again. And thank you, everyone, for being a wonderful and participatory audience.
Okay, thank you, Sue and Phil. That's been a really wonderful session. Good discussion going on here. I will be publishing the recording for the session very shortly, so I will send out an email to people so that they know it's available. I will also stick the slide set up on the website, if that's okay with you, Phil and Sue, and a log of the chat session as well. So you can revisit all of those interesting puns at your leisure. Okay, so I'll stop the recording now and say a final thank you, and good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you happen to be in the world.